Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Edwards, the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago, and I must say, I thought it was this group that was making all of the noise. So I'm happy to see this as a very attentive crowd tonight because we have a most important topic of conversation, and we are delighted and honored to have Vanita Gupta with us to give us her particular insights on the key issues of policing in the United States, and particularly the lessons learned from the investigation that the Department of Justice just completed recently into the ongoings in the Ferguson Police Department and the ramifications elsewhere. But we're also honored to have with us Craig Futterman, who is a clinical professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School and director of the Mandel Legal Clinic, and one of the foremost authorities on these issues, particularly in a Chicago context. So it promises to be a great conversation. The format for tonight will be a bit different than what some of you may be familiar with some of the IOP events, in that we're going to have formal remarks from Ms. Gupta, who will take us deep inside the process and the implications I just referred to. Then Craig Futterman will come up and lead a conversation. We'll also be collecting questions from you. I think everybody here should have note cards onto which we encourage you to write your questions that we will be collecting during the evening. And then we will give those questions to Professor Futterman to work them into the conversation with Ms. Gupta tonight. I also wanted to mention that as we come to the end of the academic year, we have just a few more events remaining in the Institute of Politics calendar. They include an upcoming event on Thursday, tomorrow night, back here, I believe it is. Am I right about that? Back here in this room? Yes, okay. Where we will be taking a look at the 2016 presidential race with a panel of leading political journalists. That will take place here tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. We also have a conversation next Wednesday at noon at the IOP with Andrew Srulovich, who's the Director of European Affairs for the Anti-Defamation League, taking a look at the rise of anti-Semitism and religious intolerance in Europe. So that promises to be also a timely conversation. That's at noon at the IOP, 1 block away. You can find out more about all we do on our website, as I've mentioned before, at politics.uchicago.edu. Please allow me to introduce the student who will be formally getting our program started tonight. Liz Additiva has been a key leader at the IOP and also on campus with a number of different entities, including the Organization of Black Students. She's also very involved in the Women in Public Service Leadership Program of the Institute of Politics, among many others. She's a second year in the college. She hails from Dallas, Texas. And please join me in welcoming her to the podium to begin our program. Thank you, Liz.
Hello. On August 9th, 2014, the death of the young, unarmed Michael Brown at the hands of Officer Darren Wilson shook not only the town of Ferguson, but the entire nation as well. Cries of no justice, no peace, and Black Lives Matter reverberated throughout every major metropolitan city for days, if not weeks. Many hoped that this incident would be the last, that the anger and civil unrest in these communities would be enough to move the needle and end the cycle of police killings of Black and brown men, women, and children. And yet, the list has only grown. November 22nd, Tamir Rice. April 4th, Walter Scott. April 12th, Freddie Gray. The list goes on, leading many to question whether these communities will be served any justice at all. However, tonight, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you a force that just may change that. Ms. Vanita Gupta is a true legal champion of civil rights. Upon graduating from the NYU School of Law, Ms. Gupta began working with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and rose to prominence through her valiant efforts in the overturning of the wrongful drug convictions of 38 Black men, in a case often referred to as a national symbol of racial injustice. After a long tenure at the American Civil Liberties Union, Ms. Gupta now serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General and Head of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice. Might I also add that she is simultaneously the youngest and first South Asian individual to hold this position. Less than a year in, Ms. Gupta has been hailed on both sides of the aisle and has already led the DOJ to reach settlements with law enforcement in New Mexico and Alabama. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Craig Futterman, University of Chicago law school professor and founder of the Civil Rights Accountability Project. Ms. Gupta will share her remarks, and then we will lead to a moderated session by Professor Futterman. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Ms. Vanita Gupta.
Thank you. It is really terrific to be here this evening. I guess I don't need this because this is the mic I'm using. So, just as a caveat, I seem to be on the verge of losing my voice, but I'm holding out for this evening because I wanted to be here, and so I'm hoping that it won't peter out during the course of this talk. I'm really excited to be here, and I want to thank you, Steve, and the Institute for Politics, and the students of that. That's great. Thank you. The University of Chicago. I understand you're a week away from finals, so kudos especially to you and to folks in the community that have turned out tonight. It really is an honor to speak with you about the work of the Civil Rights Division, particularly our work to ensure that policing is done in accordance with the Constitution and to help police departments and communities they serve build trust where it is eroded. So we just heard some names: Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, John Crawford, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray. These names and many others have become familiar to us under tragic circumstances in recent months. And their deaths and those of other unarmed African-American men and women in encounters with police officers have provoked widespread responses across the country and have fueled the Black Lives Matter movement. In communities of color in particular, the reaction has been very sobering. And in the 7 months, I've only been at the Civil Rights Division for 7 months, and it has been an intense whirlwind of a time, I can tell you. I have spent a lot of time with local leaders and community members in cities all over the country, including with numerous mothers whose children were killed in police officer-involved shootings. And the pain and anger and frustration, the lack of trust in the police is real, and it is profound. And again, people have told me that young people are losing faith in our justice system and that they view law enforcement as preying on them rather than protecting their loved ones. They talk about how the police don't value their rights or indeed their lives. And they talk about being tired of being viewed as criminals first and human beings second. Now, the conversations in these rooms, however, is not about whether or not to have the police, but actually about what kind of policing communities want and deserve. There is no question that we need police in our communities. Police officers ensure the safety of our communities by patrolling neighborhoods, defending the rights of victims, and deterring crime. They are our first responders in emergency situations, and they can be role models for our young people. The overwhelming majority of men and women who serve as police officers do their jobs with distinction, honor, and pride. And most of those individuals are driven to the police academy out of a commitment to public service and a desire to make an impact on their communities. And as we are reminded in the senseless and tragic assassinations of the 2 officers with the NYPD last December, with the shooting of 2 officers in Ferguson in March, and the tragic injuries that were inflicted on that night of violence on Monday night in Baltimore a few weeks ago, officers do this all at considerable risk to themselves. And so actually what I'm struck by everywhere I go is this very wide gap in empathy, in common language to discuss these problems. Because in the very same cities and rooms where I speak with folks in the community, I also hear from law enforcement. I hear about how they feel attacked and undervalued and how they feel like they are doing the best jobs that they can. They talk about how their entire profession has been tarnished by a few bad actors. They talk about the fact that department budgets have been slashed over the last several years, resulting in drastic cuts for community policing and neighborhood patrols. They point out that they are constantly making split-second decisions, and people aren't recognizing all the times, the thousands of times when situations don't escalate. They talk about the daily stress of their jobs and the toll that that takes. And they are right about all of this. But despite these divergent themes, there really is one commonality in all the rooms that I am in. And that is that everyone agrees that we are confronting grave challenges when it comes to the erosion of trust between police and the communities that they serve throughout the United States. The level of mistrust and resentment is unsettling. And some, including NYPD Commissioner William Bratton, call it a crisis. The consequences of distrust between law enforcement and the communities they serve can be devastating. Where people perceive the criminal justice system to be arbitrary and unfair, They are less likely to cooperate with law enforcement, making us all less safe. The distrust and alienation experienced in some of these communities can really build into a powder keg of resentment, ready to be ignited at any point. And we've seen this tape over and over again. We saw it in Watts in 1965. We saw it in Los Angeles in 1992. We saw it in Ferguson in 2014. And it's worth asking, first, how did we actually get here? And second, what are we going to actually do about it? Now, let me start with the first question and consider the source of mistrust. Mistrust can't be explained by the knee-jerk reaction of the ill-informed or the hyperbolic. It has many sources, and for some people, it's in part the product of historical awareness about the role that police played, as Commissioner Bratton recently told a group of officers, in slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, lynching, and blockbusting. FBI Director James Comey has likewise noticed that at many points in American history, law enforcement has enforced a status quo that was brutally unfair, often brutally unfair to disfavored groups. As Commissioner Bratton explained, this history has an enduring effect. He said, none of us did these things. He told this to an audience of officers. And he said, none of us were troopers on the bridge at Selma. But it doesn't matter that these things happened before many of us were even born. What matters is that our history follows us like a second shadow. The mistrust is also the product of lived experience, of negative interactions that individuals or their family members, friends, and neighbors have had with law enforcement. Something as quietly humiliating as being mistreated during a traffic stop or being followed in a retail store. These stories can circulate through neighborhoods or these days across the nation via social media, and they can build over time into a very painful narrative that divides community members from the police. The lack of trust also undeniably results from our criminal justice policies over the last few decades and the concentrated impact that they have had on communities of color and people living in poverty. Law enforcement practices such as the stopping and frisking of young black men based on stereotypes, sentencing policies that have resulted in mass incarceration, particularly of people of color, and the devastating consequences that convictions have had on an individual's ability to find work, secure and stable housing, reintegrate as members of society, find jobs. We bear the responsibility to confront these consequences and reevaluate our approach to criminal justice. The Civil Rights Division's investigation and March 2015 report on the Ferguson Police Department speaks to much of what I've been talking about. And tonight, Chirag Baines has joined me from the Civil Rights Division. He was a member of the investigative team of the Ferguson Police Department who helped write the report. In Ferguson, we found a community where unlawful police practices created an intensely charged atmosphere where people feel under siege by those charged to serve and protect them. We determined that the FPD, the Ferguson Police Department, engages in a pattern and practice of constitutional violations in violations of federal law. And specifically, we found that the FPD conducts stops without reasonable suspicion and arrests without probable cause in violation of the Fourth Amendment. We found that they were using excessive force in violation of the Fourth Amendment, that they were unlawfully interfering with First Amendment rights, including the right to record and to protest police activity, that there was impermissible discrimination against African Americans in violation of the 14th Amendment in federal statutory law, and that they were violating due process and equal protection in the operation of their municipal court. We found that this unconstitutional conduct stems really from the interaction of two dynamics: Ferguson's undue focus on revenue generation through policing and pervasive racial bias in the police department and its court system. These dynamics really fostered unconstitutional practices at nearly every level of Ferguson's law enforcement. One example, and we have many in our report. If you haven't read it, I would urge you. I just learned actually the other week that the New Press is publishing the Ferguson report, so it'll become a book apparently. During the summer of 2012, a Ferguson officer had detained a 32-year-old African-American man who had just actually finished playing basketball at a park. And the officer approached the man while the man was sitting in his car cooling off. The car's windows did appear to be more heavily tinted than the Ferguson code allowed, so the officer may very well have had grounds to question him. But with no apparent justification, the officer proceeded to escalate the situation, accusing the man of being a pedophile. He prohibited the man from using his cell phone, ordered him out of his car for a pat-down search, even though he had no reason to suspect that the man was armed. And when the man objected, citing his constitutional rights, the police officer drew his gun, pointed it at the man's head, and arrested him on 8 different counts. And the arrest then caused the man to lose his job. We observe that even minor code violations can sometimes result in multiple arrests, jail time, and payments that exceed the cost of the original ticket many times over. For example, in 2007, one woman in Ferguson had received a two parking tickets that together totaled $152. And to date, she'd paid $550 in fines and fees to the city of Ferguson. She's been arrested twice for having unpaid tickets, and she'd spent 6 days in jail. And yet she still inexplicably owes Ferguson $541. Her story is just one of dozens that we documented in our report. In Ferguson, we also found evidence of unlawful discrimination. Some of this made a lot of news. African Americans make up 67% of the population, but from 2012 to 2014, they constituted 85% of the people subject to a vehicle stop, 90% of those who received a citation, and 93% of those arrested. And discretionary police actions were overwhelmingly concentrated on the Black population. To take just one example, 95% of quote-unquote manner of walking in roadway charges, that's jaywalking anywhere else, were levied against African Americans. And we found that racial disparities in virtually every available metric. So from 2012 to 2014, African Americans were more than twice as likely as white drivers to be searched during vehicle stops, but 26% less likely to be found in possession of contraband. In 88% of the cases in which the FPD documented the use of force, force was used against African Americans. In every single case in which canines were used, the subjects were African American. The evidence of racial bias comes not only from statistics, but also from remarks made by police and court supervisors in disturbing email messages. The emails were really incontrovertible evidence of a culture that tolerated and perhaps was infected by racial bias. These findings really reveal that the public trust in the Ferguson Police Department and its criminal justice system, especially among African Americans, was damaged long before August of 2014. And whereas there is this level of broad community distrust, public safety suffers, and the job of delivering police services is rendered that much more difficult and more dangerous. Now, in many ways, Ferguson is not an anomaly. We know from our work around the country that some of the same police and court practices that we identified in Ferguson and the same deficit of trust between police officers and communities exist in many other places. Local officials recognize this as well. I now know of many police chiefs around the country who've actually assigned the report as required reading to their officers. And in light of the report, cities around the country are beginning to really re-examine their policing and municipal court practices. And I think that that is a positive step, but obviously we know there is much more work to do. Now, in many communities, thoughtful police and city leaders are really working to reprioritize community policing and rebuild community trust. Take Cleveland. I was just in Cleveland last week. Mayor Frank Jackson asked the Civil Rights Division to investigate the Cleveland Division of Police in March of 2013. And in December of 2014, we announced the results of our investigation, concluding that Cleveland officers engaged in a pattern of practice of unreasonable and unnecessary force, including deadly force such as shootings and head strikes with impact weapons. We also found that there had been the pattern of excessive force had really corroded public trust in law enforcement. Now, thanks to the commitment of Mayor Jackson and Police Chief Calvin Williams, the city's police unions, and I think very importantly, community members from all across Cleveland, we entered into a negotiated reform agreement a mere 5 months after announcing our initial report. That is fairly record time for the Civil Rights Division, but it really, I think, was a signal of the time and the impetus, the public impetus, and the demand for us to come up with answers and solutions for the city of Cleveland. And the agreement takes the form of a consent decree that will be independently monitored and enforceable by court. It really is a truly innovative and comprehensive agreement. When I was speaking at the press conference last week, I talked about how this agreement could be, again, just like the Ferguson Police Department, this one is a model agreement that contains a lot of solutions for communities around the country that are struggling with these issues. It addresses officer needs by requiring the Cleveland Division of Police to develop an equipment and resource plan to ensure that officers have the equipment they need, such as computers and safe vehicles, to do their jobs safely. It calls for a whole host of additional training and an effective employee assistance program to give officers access to mental health and support resources. It sets up a new community police commission made up of 10 civilian representatives from across the city and 1 member from each of the city's police unions that will work with the Division of Police to improve community policing, bias-free policing, and transparency. This is now a structured way for the community to have engagement in a regular way into the police department's policies, training, and everything else that is going to be developed through our consent decree. And through this body, that is going to be the way that the community is going to be able to have a sense of a democratically accountable division of police. The agreement also calls for a civilian head of internal affairs to ensure that internal investigations of misconduct are impartial and reliable. It requires specialized training in interacting with persons in mental health crisis and a mental health response advisory committee to foster relationships between the police, the community, and mental health providers. It requires revised use of force policies and training that are going to require officers to use de-escalation techniques rather than force whenever possible. It strengthened reporting and supervision requirements along with broad data collection. It requires that police officers run to first aid rather than waiting for any period of time. It requires many other provisions that are aimed at promoting public safety and building trust. I can't do it justice. It's a 107-page consent decree, but it again contains a lot of different tactics and techniques and training, and there's a lot of work to be done. Actually, we've kind of closed out this phase, but now there's a whole new phase of work that remains. And the Cleveland Agreement, to me, really reflects the commitment by the city and the Division of Police to work with the Cleveland community to transform its police agency into a model of community-oriented policing. The agreement also, to me, really demonstrates that people can come together across perceived differences to realize a common vision of a safer and more just city. Now, Baltimore is another city in which you can now see why my 7 months have been a little busy. But Baltimore is another city in which local officials are stepping up to tackle long-standing divisions and police community divisions. Now, last month, Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake asked us to investigate the Baltimore Police Department for a pattern or practice of civil rights violations. And that same day, the city's police commissioner and police union released statements agreeing with the mayor's request and welcoming our involvement. I will say not every city reacts that way. Gene Ryan, though, president of the Baltimore City Fraternal Order of Police, head of the local union, released a statement saying that the union intends to, quote, fully cooperate with any investigation that has the potential to correct departmental deficiencies and improve the morale of our members. As a labor union that represents the nearly 3,000 active duty members of the agency, we agree with the mayor on her invitation to the Department of Justice and welcome their investigation fully, as we too have issues with many of the current policies and procedures of the department. Now, after considering the relevant factors, we accepted the city's invitation and have opened up this investigation. And wherever the investigation may lead, and we don't know what we're going to find, and we won't prejudge the outcome, we have, in fact, had investigations that have led to no constitutional violations. Our goal is to work with the community, with public officials, with law enforcement officers, with police unions to help build a stronger and better Baltimore. And as events in both Baltimore and Cleveland show, the commitment of all of these local actors is critically essential if we're going to move forward, to restore trust where it's been badly eroded, to promote healing and address problems that are common to so many great cities in America. We also know that policing and these issues often fall within a broader set of issues around education, housing, disability rights, a whole host of issues that we work on, employment at the Civil Rights Division. And so there's a broader context for the work that we do, and we are trying more and more at the Civil Rights Division to break out of our silos to address some of these questions. Now, I said that there were two questions. What the sources of mistrust are, but also what are we going to do about it? And the second question is hard. But we really do have an unprecedented opportunity right now to address fundamental problems in the way that communities interact with the police. Well, the Civil Rights Division and others in this room, including many of you, I'm sure, have been working on policing for many years. The nation's really paying attention to it because communities are demanding it. The reality is that we tend to confront systemic problems only when we're forced to by extraordinary events. Journalists now are writing and doing very impressive investigative reporting on excessive force, racial profiling, and police community relations. Universities, like here, doing important research, clinical work, analysis of these problems. And families are talking about them around the dinner table. But we all know that these problems aren't new. Importantly, I think the focus on policing issues is happening within a broader conversation around criminal justice issues in this country. There is no question, and I speak from very personal experience of having basically committed my career to these issues, that criminal justice reform 15 years ago was a very lonely endeavor. There were very few on the left or the right who were really truly championing its cause. And today there is widespread, even bipartisan recognition that our criminal justice system needs an overhaul, that it cannot anymore be the go-to answer for every social problem, that mass incarceration has damaged this country in countless ways. Law enforcement leaders themselves are talking about how they have become first responders for a whole host of social problems, including homelessness, mental illness, drug dependency, school discipline. There's a growing consensus that in too many places, the only response that we have made available to these challenges is arrest and incarceration, as opposed to evidence-based alternative interventions. And there really is real reform taking place on these broader criminal justice issues around the country right now. And so for these reasons, we should be optimistic about the moment, because the public is engaged and there really is an opportunity for real progress. So what is the work ahead? At the Civil Rights Division, we have redoubled our efforts to ensure that policing is done in accordance with the Constitution. We can and do prosecute individual officers for intentional misconduct. We have a very high bar. We have one statute, very different than what is available at the state level. But even despite that high bar, we have prosecuted nearly 400 law enforcement officers over the last few years for constitutional violations. This includes our joint prosecution with the Chicago U.S. Attorney's Office of former Chicago Police Department Commander John Burge in 2010 on perjury and obstruction charges relating to the torture and abuse of detainees in the 1980s, which I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with. Criminal prosecution, though, is just one tool, and it's a limited one at that. We also engage in systemic reform of police departments like in Ferguson and Cleveland that I just mentioned. And since the start of this administration, the division's opened 22 investigations into police departments. We've also entered 17 agreements with law enforcement agencies, including consent decrees in New Orleans, Puerto Rico, Seattle, Portland, Detroit, the list goes on, Albuquerque, Los Angeles. The department currently has 8 open investigations, and in the majority of these investigations, we will issue findings or provide technical assistance. And as discussed before, the division's actually often invited into these jurisdictions by local elected officials and law enforcement and the community. And working together with police officers and community members, we are really helping to change the way police services are delivered around the country, to reduce the unnecessary use of force and to combat the influence of biased decision-making in law enforcement. And for the last 5 years, we've been calling this work Police Reform Work 2.0, because actually we learned a lot from doing this work the first 15 years of enforcement, and we've incorporated those lessons into the new work. The new kind of iteration of this work really draws upon successes in certain parts of the country where the community was deeply engaged in helping us do the investigations, in helping us produce the remedies, in helping us implement and enforce the agreements. We spent a lot of time speaking and engaging with the community, town hall meetings, individual interviews, finding out what their experience is with the law enforcement. But we also spent a lot of time learning from law enforcement, from officers, from police unions, where we learned that they've been completely unsupported or inadequately supported in training, policy guidance, support, supervision, even equipment that makes their job less safe and erodes the trust that they could have with the community. Then even after we announced these findings, we continue intensive engagement with all of the various stakeholders, including all of these folks that I just mentioned, to negotiate an agreement at arm's length with the city. And in Ferguson, just recently in the last several weeks, since announcing our findings, we've been meeting with community groups, holding open community forum, finding out what kind of police department they want, what is it that they want to look like. We need to have them drive the solutions for their communities. Several weeks ago, our attorneys facilitated small group discussions armed with these oversized notepads with markers, kind of taking down groups' ideas. And in our view, this is really how reform starts. The stakeholders in a police department have to feel invested in the reforms that we're putting forward if they're going to be sustainable and long-lasting in any community. And that includes the stakeholders that are in law enforcement themselves. This inclusive approach to reform, we have found, actually has been very successful in certain communities where we've engaged. For example, we found certain common themes in our consent decrees. Police commanders have to create opportunities for line officers to have positive interactions outside of the enforcement context with individuals that they're going to encounter as victims, witnesses, and subjects. That's a fundamental component to community policing. Departments also have to be committed to transparency, because the more that communities know about police activity, the more the operations can actually reflect community values and priorities. Structured community engagement is vital. There are a host of models for this, including civilian oversight models. We also always need better research and data. We are often in police departments analyzing and crunching data for the first time that they have had, but they haven't been able to study. It provides them with a lot of insight. There has to be fair, consistent, and robust internal and external accountability systems so that police departments can course correct when problems are actually identified. Improper bias, both explicit and implicit, has to be identified and corrected. Specialized training to deal with people in mental health crisis and other crises. Training in de-escalation, dealing with immigrants that have language barriers, LGBTI communities, other vulnerable populations. And procedural justice. We are constantly pushing forward procedural justice, showing there's tons of research that shows that actually being treated fairly and respectfully by the police often matters more than the ultimate outcome of a person's interaction with law enforcement. So we build all of these concepts into our consent decrees. And over the past years, the division has successfully concluded a series of consent decrees, including most recently with the Missoula, Montana Police Department, where we had done an investigation and had an agreement around problems with campus sexual assault that really led to kind of a change in the culture of the way that the police department was dealing and is leading to change with the way the university is dealing with campus sexual assault and sexual assault issues more broadly. The Civil Rights Division is also trying to address problems of policing from every angle. For example, our educational opportunities section, headed by Anurima Bhargava, who's here today too and is a homegrown from Chicago, has been working to disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline by intervening where school discipline practices are overly punitive and disproportionately affect students of color. Our employment litigation section's been bringing suits around the country to end discrimination in police hiring. And our federal coordination and compliance section is working to ensure that police and court services are available to those with limited English proficiency. Now, the division is focused, but I would say also the Attorney General and the President are focused, and many of you may have followed the 21st Century Policing Task Force report, another report that is of use to communities all over the country. Recently, the President announced an open data project to encourage more openness with police data and encourage police departments to ensure that they are keeping this data that would lead to reduction of force and transparency. There's been a lot of initiatives from the Department of Justice, the National Initiative for Building Community Trust, a very innovative $5 million initiative that is working around the country to reduce racial bias, support reconciliation between communities, and enhance procedural justice. Attorney General Lynch is very committed, has been going around the country. This is a top priority issue for her, obviously, as well. And we know, though, as I said before, that good policing and addressing these issues go beyond just the mechanics of policing itself. We are going to have to confront our criminal justice issues, the unfairness and inequality that many perceive to be a part of the system. And that's really why I think the Department of Justice launched, under Attorney General Holder, the Smart on Crime initiative to change some of the charging practices by federal prosecutors to incentivize them differently, to ensure that we weren't sending the wrong people to prison for too much time, that we were being safer and smarter with our resources. Along with the Access to Justice initiative, the Civil Rights Division's also been working to improve state public defense systems and reform of local courts and jails for people who are too poor to afford fines. We've been addressing conditions of problems of conditions in America's jails and prisons, including the overuse of solitary confinement and those with particularly with kids and those with mental illness. So this is just, I'm giving you a very small window into some of the different areas of criminal justice that we are working on. But ultimately, look, the federal government can only do so much. Change ultimately happens locally. And it really requires persistent and sustained engagement between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. And so I want to just be clear about one thing before I end, which is that there's been a lot of talk around the country about the problems. And I think that we will continue to see protests in the street demanding change, and we should demand change. We should have police departments that are democratically accountable to the communities that they serve. But I also want to stress that we know that we can accomplish the sweeping reforms that I've discussed. In Portland, Oregon, for example, 2.5 years after we identified an institutional pattern of excessive force against people with mental illness, police officers now are being retrained, accountability measures implemented, and the incidence of use of force has dropped dramatically. In East Haven, Connecticut, residents are seeing transformative change with their police department, where there was evidence of intentional racism on the part of the police chief, the former police chief, just 2 years after a consent decree. There really is reason to be optimistic. Seattle, transformative change on the use of force issues that Seattle was confronting. And I think that there really is reason to be optimistic that we are able to achieve reform that is going to keep individuals, communities, and police safe and ensure that communities have fair, impartial, and constitutional policing. There is no question that we have a lot of work to do, but I think there is a sense of urgency in this country right now. It's probably why you have invited me to come here to speak on these issues. But beyond the federal government and the legal community, there are concrete roles for people that are committed to improving police-community relations and enabling racial reconciliation. It may seem trite, but it is actually very powerful when local communities and local law enforcement engage directly and constructively with each other, when we can actually understand each other and understand who each other is in each other's lives. It's hard work, and it's unsung work, but it's actually quite essential. And there's a role here for anyone who wants a fairer and more equal society. There really is no problem that is too intractable or impossible for people committed to justice. Justice requires hope, and it requires hard, persistent work. And we cannot sit idly by and hope that the public is just going to stop paying attention to these issues or that these issues will get swept under the rug, because they won't, or they won't for long. And so I want to thank you for coming out here, for caring about these issues, and for your commitment to justice. And I hope that you will all work with the Department of Justice on these issues at this very urgent time. Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to bring my tea.
And water, too. First, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for your inspiring work, the work of your colleagues. It's an honor to be on the stage and to meet you in person and to have this conversation with you. I'm also grateful that your voice held out. It's amazing in just that short amount of time how much both information and inspiration you packed in just that time. I think I want to start just with a couple of your comments. I mean, one, you described powerfully the nature of distrust between certain communities and police, and particularly folks in African American communities, and that it's not a new issue. It didn't just start with the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, and also your note that it's not just a Ferguson issue. I also really appreciated your comments about both the costs, the cost of this mistrust, and the causes. One of my colleagues often tells me that, unless we really understand, unless we have a good diagnosis what's going on with the causes, we're never going to have appropriate remedies. But I know folks here want to talk a lot more, and you laid out, I think, such an ambitious agenda, but a practical agenda, real practical solutions for reform, and want to talk about solutions. But before we do, I guess I first wanted just to ask you about where we are now in terms of challenge, and starting really with the question of what you see as the greatest challenge to improving relations between Black communities and police.
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of challenges. Sorry. I think that there are...
I tried to give you a break with your voice.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I think there are too many places around the country where there may be that kind of simmering unrest, where one incident, a critical incident, could really trigger massive unrest. But I do think that with that challenge, I was just spoke at the African American Mayors Conference last week, and I'm going to be speaking at the National Mayor's Conference soon. There's no question, though, that city leaders around the country are paying attention and saying, wait, what is the relationship that I have with the community, that I have with the police chief, that I have with line officers? I think a lot of police chiefs are asking, have I been engaging with the community that I'm serving? What does that look like? So despite the fact that I think that there is a lot of stress in the country right now on these issues, I do think that there is a tremendous opportunity that a lot of city and local officials are using right now to basically self-evaluate. And the reality is the Justice Department gets asked to go into many, many more communities than we can ever be in. And we're not going to be able to solve these problems, right? I mean, when I say that we've been in 22 police departments, many of them are very large. But with every one of our consent decrees, we aren't doing the job that we should be doing unless they're having kind of a force multiplying effect. And I will say that I don't know that police chiefs and mayors were reading our reports in quite the same way that they are now.
Yep.
And so I think that there are some real challenges, and I think one of them is that policing isn't happening in a vacuum. A lot of police chiefs feel very frustrated that they are the first responders for all of these issues, that they are often the face of government in many communities that feel very disempowered and disenfranchised from government. And so mayors have to be able to start to address that in a more holistic way. What's happening in school departments, what's happening in housing, but I think it would also be a mistake to just deflect the work by saying this problem is too macro, I can't start anywhere. And there is work to be done in policing itself. And so I think that these are just some of the flavor of challenges that we're facing, but the more that can be done preemptively, and I say this to mayors and chiefs everywhere, which is don't wait until there's a critical incident in your community to actually understand what the dynamics are in your community and before things really explode.
Well, let's talk about one of the macro issues that you talked about a bit in your remarks. Let's start with race. And you highlighted really the various roles of race, racial bias, and racism, and the role that it's played in the distrust that you described. But when we talk about these macro problems, and when we talk about issues of race, people often just throw our hands up in the air that it seems like that's too big. And it's not just the police; it's an issue far beyond the police. Bias exists in all of us. And then honestly, there are a lot of us just don't want to talk about race. And we also don't want to, and many still want to minimize the role that racism still plays today. And yet you found, and Department of Justice has found, then the real existence of racism and racial bias in Ferguson and in other departments, in some other departments around the nation. And I guess so if bias, the softer term, and racism, the harder term, continues to play such a role in the way that people are treated by police, what can we do, focusing first on law enforcement, what can we do to address issues of racism and bias in law enforcement?
Sure. I mean, I think the reality is we all need to accept that we all have implicit bias. And there's no question there's been tremendous science now on the study of implicit bias. And one of the things that we found, and not all of our consent decrees actually find discriminatory policing or address it, but we have found actually that one of the key things is just to be able to identify it and to be able, we can be trained to kind of have a different set of questions when in very intense situations we are confronted with that, and we can kind of train our minds to think differently in those situations. And there's been a lot of science on that. And that has actually fueled a lot of our trainings around the problems of race and race infecting decision-making in law enforcement. It's the same, there's racial bias in healthcare delivery. We all have implicit bias, but the key is what do you do about it, right? And many of us are just in denial that we have any of it. Now, in law enforcement, obviously, the stakes are fairly high. And so there is, though, we have found in numerous police departments where we have actually found evidence of discriminatory policing. It's a multi-layered thing. It's not just kind of one training. community policing essentially really is an ethos of policing. It infuses every policy and every practice that a police department engages in, including kind of the ability to recognize implicit bias and to be able to train around it. The ability to understand when people may have particular reactions around when they're going to use force and when they don't need to, and the like. Data really matters. The ability to identify the impact of actions looking back so that you can kind of account for it moving forward. All of these things are kind of built in. And obviously, if you get too macro, it
Right.
feels like you just can't do anything. This is just the history of the country. But I actually think in area after area, there really is a lot of very kind of practical things that people can do to train around these things. But I also think, frankly, the conversation that we're having in this room or that people are having in their classrooms that maybe you weren't having as much 4 years ago or 3 years ago is part of it too. I mean, we're talking about it a little bit more, and the Attorney General Holder talked about it a lot more than I think what people were used to from a public official. I think the president's been acknowledging it.
Yes.
Attorney General Lynch talks about it. I think there's just no denying it, but I also think that it's a mistake to just say we're going to give up and not do anything, because there are a lot of practical solutions. It's the same thing, frankly, with, there are a lot of different ways in which these issues play out, and I think that we have to be able to create venues for these conversations, but also to be practical about how we're going to kind of like build back trust around some of these big fissures.
One of the things that you mentioned when you were holding out examples, you talked about East Haven, Connecticut, and I remember the investigation, and you've talked about the success of the decree just 2 years in, and East Haven, and another example that didn't talk about, but I know something also that the department is involved in, like Maricopa County, Arizona. And those are two places that raise real issues of discriminatory policing, focusing on immigrant communities and Latinos in particular in both of those places. So are there any special challenges that you found, particularly with respect to building trust between immigrant communities and police in your work?
I mean, so, every one of our investigations is wildly different from the other. I think it's like, sometimes people think, oh, did you pull out the formula, the binder from the book to say, oh, okay, these are the 5 things that this police department needs to do. And so the demographics are different almost everywhere we go. And because we are drawing so much from the community to help us identify the problems, as well as to be able to help us think through what the solutions are going to be, they are driven by the local community. And so in East Haven, for example, a lot of the transformation that we've seen has really been as a result of a joint commitment by the city leadership and the community to work together to break through these issues. There were prosecutions of police officers, no doubt. There was a change in leadership, and sometimes that may be required. That isn't dictated by us. That is dictated by the city. But there are times where we absolutely have to account for a very specific set of issues. I will say Maricopa County it's a very different situation.
Right.
There was not an amicable resolution or kind of an agreement, and so we are litigating that case. I'm actually recused from that case, so I can't talk too much about it, but because of my place of former employment. But yeah, I mean, I think even where it's black, brown, white, whatever the racial demographic it is, because a lot of these issues are not necessarily about race. There are black officers on forces where we find excessive use of force problems too, where we actually really have to be very locally tailored for the solutions. And we have to understand what the set of policies are that may be driving some of the police practices and work towards remedying them there.
Thanks. I'd like you to talk a little bit about something very near and dear to my heart, accountability, issues of police accountability, in terms of what the role is in accountability in building and restoring trust. Why is that important? And maybe relatedly, I mean, as you mentioned, being a police officer is a tough job, and it's a job that we all ought to respect, and officers see people at their very worst. No one likes being arrested, right? And we tell police to do things that sometimes I think feel contradictory. Keep us all safe, protect us from violence, get criminals off the street. And then at the same time, we criticize police for harassing us or being discriminatory in their efforts to do just that. And I wonder, are we putting officers in this catch-22 and really related to the accountability issue? Is it important, and how can we make police both effective and accountable at the same time? Are those mutually exclusive goals?
Yeah, you know, they aren't mutually exclusive goals. And I think maybe for too long, they have felt like they were mutually exclusive goals. You know, Ron Davis, who's a very close colleague of mine, who runs the COPS program, the Community-Oriented Policing program in DC, says that public safety is not just about the absence of crime, it's about the presence of justice. And where communities feel like they have justice in their communities and in their engagement with law enforcement and with the criminal justice system, police officers' jobs are made safer, the community is made safer. They are co-creators of public safety. You know, a lot of the communities where we're in, they are often communities that are particularly kind of hot spots and require policing services. It's about the kind of policing that they want. And I think there's been a big focus on what are the crime strategies that have been deployed that people have credited with reducing crime. And there's now a much deeper conversation, I think, frankly, led by some very important police chiefs about these questions, about stop and frisk, about other kind of crime-fighting strategies that have really led over the years to a significant erosion of trust, undermining kind of a sense of co-creation of safety, and have kind of polarized communities against law enforcement. At what cost and what does, so now I think, you know, certainly at the Department of Justice, we're having many more questions with local police departments about crime fighting strategies that also are about creating partnerships with communities that are kind of co-creating that public safety as opposed to being seen as, you know, an us versus them dynamic. And it sounds trite, but it's actually, as you know, a very profound thing. And I think that there's a lot of really smart thinking right now in law enforcement on these issues.
You just mentioned stop and frisk. Huge national debate going on. I know New York, but it's not just New York. It's an issue here in Chicago and issues in other cities around the nation. And you talked about police leaders also really taking leadership in thinking about this. And I guess and a lot of the conversations have been focused on first issues of fairness, of equity. But I also wonder, and I wonder based on your work, if you have any opinions about the efficacy of stop and frisk as a law enforcement practice, how well it's worked, and what, if anything, needs to be done around it as a strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to speak in kind of gross generalizations
One size fits all,
about it.
sure.
And so what I will say is I think that between kind of concepts of procedural justice and interactions between community and the police, that police tactics that result in the erosion of trust really, I think, bear long-term consequences on public safety. And we are seeing that now. And I think that there is, you know, I hesitate to speak about it because I think that different communities have very different experiences with it, and also it's deployed in very different ways, right? And so instead of speaking generally, I think what we do at the department is we look at particular and very specific examples in specific departments to understand, you know, what are the crime fighting strategies that may have led to these problems, or have they led? I mean, in some places they haven't led to the kind of erosion of trust. What did they do that was different about their deployment of this tactic? I think that there is a lot to learn about this, and we are very concerned about discriminatory policing, absolutely, and it is something that we study. It is something that we are digging into. That we, you know, discriminatory policing is not constitutional policing, and so over and over again we are confronting these issues. But I think it's really important to kind of understand the context of that tactic within a very particular community and police department, just as I do with almost everything. I mean, tasers are used very differently in different parts of the country. So for that reason, I'm a little bit more hesitant to speak kind of in gross generalizations.
Fair. So a lot of our conversation, particularly, you know, in your role in the Department of Justice, raises that age-old question of who polices the police, and you've talked also about the roles of community. And you mentioned, of course, the Department of Justice had a long history of bringing criminal prosecutions when appropriate, civil rights prosecutions. And you've shared a lot about stuff that I think people know less about the pattern and practice powers that have been deployed over the last 20 years or so in the many investigations now led particularly under this administration. How do you measure the success of your interventions?
Yeah, it's a great question. So obviously with prosecutions, it's an easier metric. We either convict them or we don't.
Right.
But I think with the pattern and practice, kind of over time, we've gotten very sophisticated with our metrics. We build them into each of our consent decrees. So the last pages of the Cleveland consent decree are all about metrics. It also gives the community a set of benchmarks to hold us accountable in the Cleveland Division of Police. I'm just using that as an example. To be able to measure progress. And so we have benchmarks, we have timelines. It's a pretty sophisticated calculus that then the monitor can use and the community can use to say, has the Cleveland Division of Police done X, Y, and Z? And has the agreement actually achieved these various things? One of the things that we do is we do continuous community surveys that are actually quite scientific. You know, because people say, well, how do you actually measure how you build trust, right? It seems kind of wishy-washy. There are ways to measure decrease in use of force incidents. There are ways to measure decrease in discriminatory stop and frisk practices and the like. But the building of trust is actually a core component. So we do really extensive, exhaustive community surveys over time. And we have found, like in East Haven, Connecticut, that you can have a baseline. We start with these surveys when we go in, and then we're able to see how does the interaction with the police change. We survey the police too, about their feelings about the community, their interactions with the community. And so we have a lot of this kind of survey data to draw from too that helps indicate to us whether all of these tactical and strategic things that we're doing are actually at the end of the day making a difference to building back trust, which is frankly at the end of the day our goal, right? With all of this, these best practices are good things and they're things that academicians have been promoting and all of the like, but actually at the end of the day, the goal is to build back trust because that is what's needed. And so these are the ways in which we have some like pretty scientific ways, and they're getting more and more sophisticated kind of every year that we go. But it's been a very important thing, I think, for the community to have this set of metrics.
That's fascinating. I wonder, I mean, so the other thing, I guess that comes up in terms of efficacy, you're there for a limited amount of time, and you're also talking about oftentimes changing culture.
Yep.
Changing culture within the police department, which can be entrenched, culture that often outlasts a police chief, outlasts a mayor, and outlasts intervention. What are your strategies for addressing those entrenched cultures that shield civil rights violations, and how do you then, after you go, because you're going to go, try to sustain the progress that you made?
No, that's right. You know, most of our consent decrees none of them are 2 years. There are very few agreements that we have that are, and that's because culture change doesn't happen overnight. And actually, we often spend the first year and a half setting up systems in a police department around infrastructure, data, literally IT in that police department, working through and like revamping the whole thing. Our goal is to change systems. Ultimately, that's why we don't weigh in on personnel decisions. When we issued the Ferguson report, people said, is your report going to say that the chief should be fired, that the city manager should be fired? That's not our job. If the city wants to take a look at our report and say, can we actually remedy the stuff that the Department of Justice found with the personnel that we have, that's the city's job. What we are in a place to do is to change systems and build infrastructure to produce culture change over the long haul. So it doesn't matter that I'm going to leave. It doesn't matter that the police chief is going to change. It won't matter that the mayor is going to change. What's going to matter is that there's a consent decree that's going to produce a whole different set of systems, a whole different set of training, supervision, accountability systems, a way for the community to have structured accountability from the police department over the long haul. And so that's really the goal. So I will be leaving in 18 months because I have 18 months left. With a number of these, investigations open and agreements that are, the career staff is there. The good news is that the staff that's really doing the work, that's rolled up its sleeves, their career staff, they are there, and they are deeply committed to these issues. They're going to be seeing this forward. But the more important thing is, even if the city leadership changes, our work is not about people, it's about systems, because systems ultimately ensure the sustainability for the longer term change. It isn't about kind of who's at the leadership. Obviously, it matters that there's buy-in from leadership.
Right.
And it matters that people embrace reform and aren't just recalcitrant and fighting against it. But that's kind of the work that we do.
Thanks. I've been neglecting to, so I can ask you questions all day, and I'm fascinated. I'm so fascinated by your work, but I really want to share questions that have been asked by many of the folks here. So let me start with here. One question was that it's disturbing to one of the folks here, or maybe many of the folks here, to hear the framing the problem as one of mistrust or community mistrust. And it sounds too much like a blaming the victim. And I guess so the question here is, don't you think that real peace or real justice will come more quickly if we acknowledge the problems and realities of institutional racism?
Well, I think that the Ferguson report, I don't think that these things are necessarily mutually exclusive. I mean, the Ferguson report pointed to structures that perpetuated racial bias in the city of Ferguson, the municipal court, the police department. And ultimately, the level of mistrust was kind of the symptom of all of that. So to me, these are, these things actually sometimes go hand in hand. They don't exist everywhere that we do these investigations. But I think Ferguson, to me, spoke quite clearly as to the ways in which those things are actually quite intimately connected.
Thanks. Another question, and this ties into something that I was thinking about as well. So it's great when you have departments like Baltimore who come to you and say, we want you to come in, we'd like you to take a look at what we could be doing better if there are real issues that we need to address, and to have an open mind about it. But what happens, and this goes to same thing about addressing entrenched cultures, when you have a department who is kicking and screaming? And, and let me just take one example. I mean, so one of the greatest barriers to accountability that we often have are issues of codes of silence, officers refusing to testify against other officers, and then and not just at the line officer level, but a culture that goes up the chain. How do you address that? I mean, so you talked about systems. What does that mean in practice? Like, what systems would you implement to try to address something concrete, like an officer's not going to come forward against a fellow officer?
Well, I mean, so we look at, we have, as I said, the criminal prosecution side where we deal with that issue a lot. But in the pattern practice, we really do look at the number of complaints that are filed. What happens to those complaints? Are they investigated? What happens if what kind of investigations actually happen? Who's investigating? What are the consequences of misconduct? We know that police departments are going to engage in either mistakes or intentional errors. But the question is, what happens when something like that is noted? Are police departments actually taking self-corrective measures to hold people accountable, and to change systems or training, or to do things internally to ensure that those things never happen again? And I will say, in a lot of police departments where we've gone in, we've found complete lack of accountability at that level, where there is no self-correction, or that the discipline is totally arbitrary, where officers have no idea, there's not consistent or fair measures of accountability. And so we do that. I will also say, to the beginning part of that question, there are a lot of cities that aren't necessarily cheerleading for us to come in. Okay, like let's be honest about that. What we do try to do, though, is where we find deep systemic problems, and cities know that we are looking at them. We try to meet with their city leadership to say, again, at the very outset, you can embrace us coming in, or you can fight us like hell. And we've had jurisdictions that publicly will continue to fight all the way. And we are in trial. We go to trial with them. We have other jurisdictions where they know that they have serious problems. They may not have confronted them, but when we start to engage with city leadership to say, we are likely to be coming in, you've got a choice. And the mayor may say, okay, I want to embrace this. We've got a serious crisis. So I think it's all over the map for us. I will say, I think increasingly with all the attention nationwide on these issues, we are finding city leadership to be more eager to deal with these problems, lest they have kind of the scale of unrest in their community. And so I think that the climate has somewhat changed, but it's not all roses for a Justice
sure.
Department intervention.
So if I can just two final questions.
Sure.
I know we're toward the end of our time. There's one question that's about.
Can I just, say one more thing, which is.
Please.
I have been doing a lot of work over the last several months with law enforcement leadership around the country as well, and with police unions around the country. And I do it because, again, the work that we're going to do in any of these communities is not going to be sustainable unless there's some stake that people feel. As hard as it is, we're not going to agree on everything. There often, there may be kind of delayed reactions to some of the reforms we put in place. But I feel like that engagement is also really critical to being able to see culture change over the long haul. Because if there's just a sense that we're going to come in and isolate the department from the work that we're doing, we're actually not going to be nearly as successful. And so the places where we've actually seen great success in culture transformation,
when there's buy-in,
or where there's buy-in. So Seattle, there was tension there. Portland, there was tension there, but over time we were really able to kind of cultivate really strong relationships with the police chiefs, with some of the law enforcement leaders, and that makes a huge amount of difference.
I'm glad you talked about the buy-in. So, and just as one of the first questions framed about, is this really an issue of mistrust, or is that the right framing of this? The other side of the buy-in also is the role of the public and community side too. And you just mentioned Seattle and Portland, and I think those may be two wonderful examples where not only, and there may have been a lot of kicking and screaming, particularly from law enforcement on the front end, where you were successful in buy-in, but those were also examples in which the DOJ heavily involved the community in the process, and that there was then community stakeholders and buy-in there. Can you tell folks a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, that's how we do our work around the country. Right now, we started the investigation in Baltimore. We are meeting with community groups all over the city. We're meeting with law enforcement, we're meeting with the unions, we're meeting with the commissioner, we're meeting with the mayor. That's how we do this work. We kind of saturate into the community. We did it in Ferguson. Chirag can tell you all the trips he made down to Ferguson and all the time he spent there with a whole team. It's our work has to be centrally about the community and driven by the community and law enforcement. Those are the two biggest stakeholders here. And so, again, for the same reason, it is deeply important. That's how we get the information for our investigations, and it's also how we develop the best solutions. Is really through working with the community to figure out what is going to work in this community. What does the community really need to be able to have a good relationship with law enforcement, to feel like they can hold their law enforcement folks accountable, because that is ultimately what the structure of our democracy requires.
So this is the question I was trying to get to. I'm sorry I'm sorry to have neglected, about police unions. And you've mentioned unions a couple times, and in ways in which, when there have been buy-in, wonderful. And you gave a couple examples of that. And here's a question, though, about police officers' Bill of Rights. And there's a concern, and it's a concern that I've seen across the board. This is a concern that's raised and it's framed in terms of constitutionality, but just as Officer Bill of Rights and unions sometimes as real impediments to accountability. And so you have a wonderful story to say about Baltimore, but that may not be
well, look, Baltimore's just started, right?
Yeah,
and I'm glad that it started this way. So in Cleveland, we have a number of provisions in our consent decree that are going to require some serious negotiation with the union, that are going to be, the enforcement of them is going to be tricky because of arbitration issues and issues with the union. So we still have some work to be done. And there's no question that I think that there have been instances where the unions have been impediments to reform or have made it a little bit more difficult. I think that the increased engagement of the division with the police unions has been very important, because they need to be a part of the reform agenda. It makes their membership, their lives, more dangerous in the street when they don't have the kind of trust from the community. Their jobs, they are often misserved by leadership in law enforcement that may not be providing them with the right training and supervision and accountability. The Law Enforcement Bill of Rights issues is one that I think a lot of people are focusing on. Maryland has a law enforcement bill of rights. It's a pretty stringent one. It was the first of its kind.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know where our investigation will go, but there are jurisdictions where if we issue a consent decree and it's going to run up against a law enforcement bill of rights,
Right, a state
we're going to
statute.
have to look at that, and the state legislature is going to have to look at that, and there's going to be parties that are looking. We don't do state legislative work, obviously, but I think that there's no question that there are some real challenges for our ability to engage reform, but again, we can't just kind of sit back and not engage directly with them, as hard as it is.
Yep.
And as tough as it is sometimes, because I am beginning to see in certain jurisdictions a change in that conversation, even among police unions. They don't want to isolate themselves either. And I think that is an important thing, but it's not to kind of, again, gloss over the fact that there are some real challenges. We want officers to have due process in their proceedings too, but we also want to make sure that there's accountability and that there's constitutional policing. And those are the things that ultimately the country's going to have to wrestle with, and that we wrestle with in our agreements.
So to try to save your voice, if I can really truly ask you just two more questions,
still
and I
there?
won't,
Can
and I
people
won't
even
go,
hear me?
if that's
Okay.
One issue before wrapping up, I got to ask about, and you raised it, data collection. You talked about the importance of data, and I'll put my own cards on the table. I believe that, if we're talking about issues of public trust, it starts with honesty, it starts with openness, it starts with issues of transparency and acknowledging even some empirical realities and realities of some of the most affected communities. So we don't have now, at least on a national basis, mandatory data collection, reporting on fundamental issues like stop and frisk or traffic stops or even police shootings, not to mention civil, complaints, civilian complaints of civil rights violations. Not just where do you stand on it, but the question is, what can the Justice Department do? What role can the Justice Department play in this? I know this is something also that was strongly supported by the President's Commission in really making, or what needs to be done to make data collection mandatory and to implement it across the board.
Yeah, I mean, right now I think there's a real focus on the fact that there's no national database, collecting officer-involved shooting data. And I think that there's going to be a lot of movement now on this front. The Justice Department collects where we can, but it isn't mandated by law. And so ultimately, Congress has to mandate it, has to mandate that all local police departments actually turn over their data where there's an officer-involved shooting.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot more data that needs to be captured on these issues around the country, and the more we know, the more police departments know, frankly, the better they are able to look at their own department and address these issues. And I think, a lot of law enforcement leaders as well are really eager to get more kind of technology, more funding for technology to actually begin to collect this data, to get systems in place to do it. There's no question that there's a lot that police departments don't know that they should. And as I said, sometimes it's when the Justice Department goes in that we kind of begin to uncover that. And it is sometimes for the first time for a police department, and a police chief is like, wow, like this is, and that shouldn't be the case. I think a lot of police chiefs would really like to have that kind of data. And so it's something that the federal government has been pushing forth, the president has been pushing forth through a whole series of initiatives, and there's now kind of more funding for at the federal level.
Yeah, one of the things, and so I'm breaking my promises just to follow up on this, but I know in the law that that authorizes the department and the attorney general to do the pattern and practice investigations, there was a provision about collection of excessive force complaint data, that the Department of Justice would collect this data from all local law enforcement. And there was something, I remember a study that was done by DOJ back in 2006 that collected a lot of data, but haven't seen a lot since then. Is there still a role for DOJ there, or was this something that just wasn't funded? Or? Yeah,
no, I mean, we collect it every year, and there is, but as I said, police departments aren't mandated to report, so we have a lot of data from a lot of police departments, but I think there's still big holes, so we don't have a good national response. Now, there are certain initiatives. There's a group, it's a consortium of groups led by the Center for Policing Equity that has a national initiative, the National Justice Database, that is collecting for the first time national data on a whole bunch of metrics. It's going to be kept. I think they got police departments to engage in this voluntarily right now because they said they wouldn't be making it public. It would be a way for them, for 50 major police departments to be able to kind of cross-compare, see where they fall. I think the goal ultimately is to promote transparency over the long haul. And the Justice Department is working a lot with different police departments kind of nationally to figure out national best practices on data collection. The 21st Century Policing Task Force is focused on that a great deal. And so it's something that I think we're hopeful that we're going to see some changes in soon.
Thanks, Matt. This really will be my last question. I'll save your voice.
Yeah.
This is really for everybody, for everyone here. You've talked a lot and in your remarks about the role of the public and the importance of community and accountability. And that's really my question here is what responsibility do we all have? Do students have, and what can students do? What can community members do to promote accountability and improve trust in our neighborhoods? And maybe when all else fails, how do we reach out to the Department of Justice?
I think I said it at the end of my remarks that it can be kind of sound trite, but actually I think there is a real role for community members to play. The Justice Department at this point has produced reams of agreements. We have the 21st Century Policing Task Force. We have a lot of solutions kind of encrusted into these agreements. They focus on a whole range of issues: use of force, bias policing, problems with dealing with people in crisis and escalation, transparency, accountability. And just as I tell mayors, I think it's important for communities to understand, don't wait until there's a critical incident. Take a look at these reports and engage, actually. Find, the University of Chicago can be a kind of a convening point for law enforcement and for the community in structured, productive ways to engage around some of these issues. Don't wait for the Justice Department either. I mean, certainly be in touch, but there's a lot that we can't do. And I think that, there are institutions here locally that should be able to advance some of these issues as well on behalf of the communities that they are kind of located in, to be able to make sure that there's constitutional policing, that there's community policing, that officers and mayors and city officials are actually in conversation with particularly vulnerable and marginalized communities. Waiting for the Justice Department to get involved, I think, is a gross error at this time. There's no reason for it. And I do think that while individuals may feel slightly less empowered to do this, institutions that have this ability to bring folks together and to have constructive conversations certainly should be doing that.
Well, I want to thank you and for sharing your voice and really going the extra mile with all of us. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope everyone really will join me in thanking Vanita Gupta.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
As well, and to thank Craig for the job you did in leading the conversation, to thank all of you for your great questions. It was a fitting note to end on as we hope that this further propels more action and conversation on this issue. Thank you both very, very much. Thank you all for being here. We look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow night at 6 o'clock and at noon next Wednesday at the IOP. Have a great evening.